got the heater on, feeling sold out even though I'm keeping strong. But can I hold out when every bit of freedom's gone? They want me rolled out, never to sing freedom song. I wanna see the sky, I wanna feel the rain, but gotta keep away from windows, that's some window pane. It's just a shame, couldn't have planned out all our dreams. Now I scream, cause there's a man in the machine. But the train is off the tracks, and damn, it's losing steam. I wanna call Christine, I haven't seen since 013. I'm missing life like 3 strikes each night. Seems like 3 nights ain't right. Can't fight, space light, hate life, wanting to be snake-like, shedding off this gray life. In the dark can't make light, but where I'm headed now is brake lights. Where I'm headed now they brake lights. Counting days like brake lights, feeling weight like brake lights. Had a great life, brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Out of place like brake lights, in my face like brake lights. Counting days like brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Sit here asking, what have I done? If these strings were cut, I'd see my son. And if I could just fly from this place, then I'd hold you in my love embrace. And if I could just speak to you now, I'd renew my vow and be in the now.
Welcome to the 13th Unity for J Vigil for WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange. I'm Joe Lauria, the editor-in-chief of Consortium News. We have a great lineup of guests tonight. But before that, we want to get some of the headlines. And for some people who are new to our vigil, I just want to explain who Julian Assange is. He's a wanted man, and he's wanted because he's published over the years classified information that reveal crimes and corruption of government officials around the world, not just in the United States, but it's in the U.S., so-called beacon of freedom that's spreading democracy and press freedom, that has indicted him and wants him extradited to the U.S. for the crime of publishing. That's why Julian is still inside there as a refugee in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for the past 6 years. He knows that the moment he steps outside onto British territory, the British police will give him a warm welcome, in the words of the Foreign Secretary, which means his arrest and extradition to the United States, perhaps not even going before a judge, going right into a car to the airport and to the U.S., where a courtroom number 700 in Alexandria, not far from where I'm sitting right now, is waiting for him, where he probably won't get a fair trial and will likely spend the rest of his life in prison. That's why we have these vigils. So I'm going to look at some of the headlines. Since last week's show, we gathered together some developments in the past 7 days. First, WikiLeaks has raised the $50,000 that it was seeking online to sue the Guardian newspaper in Britain over the story published in December, I believe, of last year about by Luke Harding, who we've given a sound trashing to here on this show. And I think that will continue today, for a story that Harding and two other reporters published, saying that Paul Manafort had 3 times visited Julian Assange inside that embassy in London, the Ecuadorian embassy, and that the last time was in 2016, around the time that Manafort became briefly Donald Trump's campaign manager. The article also mentions one line, that some Russians had also visited him. Now, we don't know whether these are Russian cleaners that clean the embassy or emissaries. This absolute rubbish to say that without backing it up. The article had no evidence whatsoever. And as many people pointed out, Craig Murray being amongst the first, that the embassy is bathed in surveillance cameras. It is one of the most surveilled places in one of the most surveilled cities on earth, London. And there would certainly be photographic evidence of Paul Manafort coming in. There were police stationed outside the embassy at that time for the early visits. They've been withdrawn subsequently. Anyone who visits that embassy to see Julian Assange or anyone has to sign in at the front desk, leave their passport, their cell phone. There's no way that Paul Manafort would have gotten in there without evading all of that. And since that evidence was never produced in the Guardian story, it's a very likely possibility that that story is fabrication. That's indeed what John Pilger reported to us when I interviewed him a couple of weeks ago, after he had just seen Julian Assange inside the embassy, and they discussed the Guardian story at length, he told me, and they concluded, of course, that it was an absolute fabrication, because Julian Assange knows who he meets and who he hasn't met, and Paul Manafort was not one of them. Interestingly, that story had only 2 bylines online, but in the print edition, there were 3 bylines. And the third, which did not appear online, the third, which of course is a permanent record online, whereas the print edition of The Guardian winds up wrapped around fish and chips or worse in London. So Fernando Valenciencio is the third byline on that story. Now, who is Fernando Valenciencio? He's now been exposed as a guy who calls himself a journalist running an investigative journalism site in Ecuador. But it's now been shown, and Ben Norton, the journalist, is the one who first reported on this. He has received a $65,000 grant from the National Endowment for Democracy. Everybody on my panel here knows what the National Endowment for Democracy is. It's national and some kind of an endowment, but I think it has little to do with democracy. It, of course, has been the arm of U.S. government to try to foster uprisings around the world. In fact, Washington Post journalist who is very close to the CIA, his name escaped me, but you guys are going to tell me right now, wrote a piece back in 1980 in which he said that the NED, was now doing what the CIA used to do covertly. They're doing openly, which was to foment rebellion against nations in the Soviet sphere at that time. So it's openly known that that's what the NED does. And they paid this guy, Fernando Valenciencio, 65 grand to promote anti-Correa propaganda on that website. Correa being, of course, Rafael Correa being the previous Ecuadorian president, who gave exile to Julian Assange. The new government wants him out and has been doing everything they can to get him out, reducing heat, making it even hard to get food at times, limiting his visitors, cutting off his access to the world through the internet. Nothing is moving Julian Assange. He's staying put. Now, interestingly enough, the AFP reported that U.S. investigators will, today it was supposedly, Friday, today, this was a report today, begin to question diplomatic staff who were stationed at the Ecuadorian embassy in London during WikiLeaks founder Assange's years-long stay about his visitors. This was released information by WikiLeaks. And AFP reports that this follows international subpoenas from the U.S. Department of Justice, which is probing a report that President Donald Trump's disgraced former 2016 campaign chairman Paul Manafort had secret talks there with Assange. That's the Guardian story. That led, as we might recall, some members of Congress to call for that to be investigated. So that wasn't just some idle report on the front page of the Guardian that has never been proven and that the Guardian editors have been totally silent about ever since, despite demands to produce evidence. So the Justice Department wants to talk to 6 staff members from the Ecuadorian embassy and will start to interview them today in Quito. They're in Quito now. This is what this AFP report says. Then the AFP report talks about the Guardian story. It says the period in which he supposedly met Assange was a time when he became a key figure in the Trump campaign. And it preceded the publishing of WikiLeaks' thousands of emails allegedly stolen, at least AFP is putting allegedly in here, by Russian hackers. So this Guardian story has led to this now. U.S. Department of Justice is interviewing members of the Ecuadorian embassy to see if, in fact, Manafort went there. That will be a very interesting development. If we don't hear anything about this, I suspect that the Justice Department came up with nothing, and they all said they've never saw Manafort there. That's the way they'd probably handle that in the media. We just won't hear about it again. And some other news, perhaps less important, but encouraging nonetheless, is that Assange treatment was debated in the Bundestag in Germany this week. There's some video online of that debate that follows a visit to Julian Assange at the end of last year by 3 members of the Bundestag. And then shortly after, a statement released by, I think, 50 EU members of parliament and members of the European Parliament, support of Julian Assange. That was followed again by former Australian Ambassador Tony Kevin backing Assange. And then we had that statement that has gone totally silent since by Giuliani on Fox News, in which he said that Julian Assange had committed no crimes. And he compared WikiLeaks publications to the Pentagon Papers. And he pointed out that no one from the Washington Post or the New York Times went to jail for publishing the Pentagon Papers, and nor should Julian Assange. That did not get any kind of traction. And we don't know at all whether, of course, whether Giuliani has talked to Trump about this. That would have been the significance of that story. Trump is in a position to give a pardon, which would have all kinds of political partisan consequences, of course, which may be why Trump may be holding back. We're just speculating here. Human Rights Watch this week said, quote, the United Kingdom must reject the extradition of Julian Assange to the United States. They've made statements before, but it's good to have another one. Now, this notice is quite interesting. It comes from our friend Sam Husseini, who has appeared on these vigils. He's in writing for the Institute for Public Accuracy, for which he works. He wrote, quote, at confirmation hearings this Tuesday in the U.S. for the new nominee for Attorney General, Senator Amy Klobuchar asked Attorney General nominee William Barr, quote, will the Justice Department jail reporters for doing their jobs? Now, Julian Assange's name did not come up here, but it was hanging there in the air. What was his answer to the question, will the Justice Department jail reporters for doing their jobs? Barr responded, quote, I think that, I know there are guidelines in place, and I can conceive of situations where, as a last resort, and where a news organization has run through a red flag or something like that, knows that they're putting out stuff that will hurt the country, there could be a situation where someone could be held in contempt. Chilling statement from a man who might very well become the next Attorney General of the United States. Now, Floyd Abrams, the author of one of the big First Amendment lawyers in the United States, he provided Sam Husseini at the Institute of Public Action with a statement. And Floyd Abrams said, "It's one thing to say that there could be circumstances in which a journalist's need to protect her sources could lead to a potential finding of contempt of court if she refused to obey a court order requiring such disclosure. But the notion that a journalist could properly be jailed for publishing material that the government thinks could, quote, hurt the country, unquote, is something else entirely and would be deeply threatening to the First Amendment norms in general and journalistic freedom in particular." Now, Abrams was the litigator on behalf of the New York Times in the Pentagon Papers case. And in that case, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Times and the Post, ruling that the government, in that case, the Justice Department of Richard Nixon, could not exercise prior restraint on a publisher. However, the majority opinion did hold that after publication, the government could prosecute publication of classified information, something that no administration has done, going back to the beginning of the Espionage Act because of the political consequences of it disturbing the norms of the First Amendment, if not, even though it might be legal under the odious Espionage Act to prosecute someone for publication afterwards. So on that basis, this government, the Trump administration, as anti-media as they are, and as radical in so many ways as it is, could in fact be the first to act on the Espionage Act to apprehend a publisher for merely possession and dissemination of classified material. With that, I'm going to introduce our first guests here. Well, we have David Swanson. Can I bring David in first? Because you haven't been on for a while, David. I think you've been on a Vigil before. Tell us a little about what you do and why you're interested and here. Why are you here defending WikiLeaks? And then we'll talk about with the others some of these and your own views on some of the things I've just outlined. And welcome.
Yeah, well, I'm a supporter of WikiLeaks and of Julian Assange's right to freedom. I'm here in Charlottesville, Virginia, in the United States. I'm the director of an organization called World Beyond War, campaign coordinator of an organization called rootsaction.org. I'm an author of books and articles and so forth. And what I spend my days trying to stop the United States government in particular and other governments from doing is all done as a last resort. 67% of the federal discretionary budget in the United States goes to war, goes to militarism, and every speck of it is done as a supposed last resort. So this is a meaningless and dangerous phrase, as is, of course, what hurts the country. I mean, there's no definition, there's no agreement on what hurts a country. And for people to be prosecuted for journalism on that basis, in violation of the obvious facts blurted out by Giuliani, is incredibly frightening. I don't care if you agree with Julian Assange on anything. This is incredibly dangerous. And as someone who appreciates, is incredibly grateful for what WikiLeaks has informed the world about, I have double the reason to be worried about that sort of threat. But it really ought not to matter whether you like what WikiLeaks has done or not. This is threatening the institution of journalism. And I continue to believe that the US government should be thanking WikiLeaks for the service of informing the US public what the Democratic Party was up to. We're supposed to know. This is what actual democracy involves, and should be apologizing to the Russian government for blaming it without any proof that it was it that provided this service to the US public. I'm also interested, tell me when to shut up, but I'm also interested in the fact that you mentioned this court in Alexandria, because it is about the least likely place in the world, perhaps outside of an Israeli court for a Palestinian activist, that anybody's going to find justice for anything. I sat through part of a trial of a so-called trial of Jeffrey Sterling, guy from the CIA who was blamed again for providing the service of informing the US public that the CIA had been giving nuclear weapons parts, diagrams, plans to Iran. You would think that something that insane, the US public ought to know that its government was doing. And on the contrary, when Jeffrey Sterling did, as he admits to, inform the Congress, go through the proper channels and so forth, Congress didn't do a damn thing. When somebody informed a journalist who informed the public, Jeffrey Sterling was put through a mockery of a trial with Condoleezza Rice and the rest of them coming in and very ineptly revealing new information that they would have prosecuted anybody else for revealing in the course of the trial. So we can hope for that silver lining in future trials in that court. But sending a man to prison for providing a public service as a whistleblower, and of course, this is the other part of what they're after in going after journalists. They want to go after their whistleblowers too, their sources too, I hope that they're going to leave Julian Assange alone for the simple reason that Russiagate has largely drifted so far afield, that most of it has to do with, Facebook ads and all this nonsense. And the question of who gave the information to WikiLeaks has largely been dropped. But I don't think we can rely on that. I think those of us who appreciate what WikiLeaks has done and want to stand up for the rights of every journalistic institution and individual need to increase our vigilance now, not let it slide.
You said that how WikiLeaks got the documents is not so important anymore. It's interesting. They've never interviewed anybody from WikiLeaks, Mueller's people, including Julian Assange. When they can get him, they know where he is, so he's not going anywhere. They're not interested in that aspect of it. You also raise an interesting question about the defense in that courtroom, because unlike the UK, where there is a thing called the public interest defense, even a newspaper who publishes classified information could argue that was revealed for the interest of the public. You're not allowed to do that in the US. We had Daniel Ellsberg on here a couple of weeks ago, and he was explaining how when he was on the stand, he tried to give the motive for why he did it. His lawyer asked him under examination, and the judge immediately stopped him from doing that. I've seen that myself in other trials of so-called national security. So that would likely happen, of course, would happen in the case if Julian ever took the stand. He wouldn't be able to explain that. And that takes away any possibility of a fair trial right there, I think.
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, and others on this call can fill you in much better. But I do know that on rare occasions, mostly in decades gone by, activists who have gone and hammered and poured blood on nuclear weapons and otherwise engaged in actual and symbolic sabotage of militarism have been permitted by the court to use that defense. And the results have been dramatic and to the benefit of those activists. But on many occasions, and increasingly, as far as I understand, that defense is denied and almost certainly would be denied to Julian Assange anywhere in the United States and to anyone in that court in Alexandria.
No, it's interesting because I was thinking of a very trial that I covered back in the early 90s up near in a place called Rome, New York, where indeed activists went into an Air Force base there and poured blood on B-52s and hammered it. And I was in the courtroom and the judge would not allow them to give any defense of why, any motive, and they were convicted. So that's good to hear that it has happened before. You also just wanted to talk before we bring in our next guest, and I hope you stick around or take part in the discussion, is that when you talked about the country, about it's not good for the country, it could hurt the country. What is the definition of the country, you think, that Barr, this Attorney General nominee, means? Is the country the public, as you mentioned, or a few people with a lot of power whose interests will be hurt? I think that's what he means by the country. the rulers of the country, right?
I think the best government speak, the best propaganda is always ambiguous, so that it can mean one thing and be taken to mean something else. Support the troops means bomb a foreign country. Hurt the country is supposed to be heard by viewers as meaning hurt them.
Right.
If it actually means anything at all, it means hurt the interests of the people making the decision, those
Right.
prosecutors, those courts. And so it is good as propaganda. It is extremely dangerous as public policy.
The very people that Julian Assange has revealed secrets about, which is why they want a personal revenge against him. Let's bring in Kevin Zeese. Kevin is also a longtime activist. Tell us your first involvement with WikiLeaks and anything else you want to comment on that was mentioned at the top here.
Thanks. First off, let me thank you, Joe and Consortium News for doing this. I wish
it's Unity
more
for J as well that organizes. Just want to interrupt. Susie Dawson's Unity for J. I've just taken it over recently, but thank you.
I know
anyway.
Susie's done fantastic work in this and I've thanked her before, but I just on the air, I wanted to say thank you to Consortium News. This is what media should be doing about the persecution of Julian Assange. It's amazing that an outlet like The Guardian that profited from WikiLeaks releases is now helping to persecute Julian Assange rather than standing up for his defense. I've been a political activist since law school. I graduated from George Washington in 1980. I practiced law briefly in Alexandria, Virginia. And I've been involved from the beginning, really, since 1980 in fighting for justice. I started with the end of the drug war. And I got involved in the issue of WikiLeaks in this century, almost when they started publishing, because I was working on anti-war work, and their releases on the Iraq War, on the Afghanistan War, on Guantanamo, on the State Department cables were all so relevant to our work to try to get the truth out, because every political movement begins with education, begins with getting the truth out. And we get so many lies from our mass media that we need an antidote. And WikiLeaks provides that antidote. I got involved with the Chelsea Manning case, became a member of their steering committee for the Chelsea Manning Support Network early on, and have followed that case through and organized lots of events and protests. Got people helping to get people out the courtroom to monitor that trial. And the more you saw in that case, the more important WikiLeaks became as well. I'm also on the advisory board of the Courage Foundation, which was set up by WikiLeaks to protect whistleblowers, including Julian Assange. My sense of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks is this is a breakthrough media effort. It really democratizes the media in ways that are urgently needed. Rather than a corporate media outlet controlled by its advertisers, its board members, which are also often from corporations, its investors, often from big corporations, and with close ties to the government, and sometimes kowtowing to the government on what they will talk about and publish, WikiLeaks is the opposite. It's democratized. It gives people in government, people in corporations, the tools to expose the truth. And that is very frightening. That's such a loss of control for the government over the media, to actually have people able to leak the truth anonymously from the Pentagon, from NSA, from the CIA, from the National Endowment for Democracy, and from big corporations. Is just like an astounding, transformative process that it immediately scared the power structure. And particularly when the materials leaked by Chelsea Manning exposed the day-to-day workings of the Iraq War, raw intelligence material, showing what was happening on a daily basis, videos showing that were taken by people in the military, showing what they were doing. Wow, that is a mind blower. And I have no doubt that when the history of this century is written, historians will go back through those WikiLeaks releases and will develop a history about the reality of these never-ending wars, this mass intelligence gathering, this corporate control of U.S. foreign policy, and put together amazingly honest histories about what we're living through now and what so many people don't really know as going on. So I see the persecution of Julian Assange as defining the First Amendment for now and the future. And if he is prosecuted, I hope he is not prosecuted, that case will be equivalent of the John Peter Zenger case. The Zenger case helped to create the First Amendment. And I suspect that if Julian is prosecuted, no matter how it turns out, that will help to define free speech for the remainder of this century and beyond. It will be a breakthrough moment in it will show us we need stronger free speech, free protections of the media than we currently have, because a case like Assange's case should not be even happening. He should not be having to hide in an embassy in London and being threatened and being blocked from communicating with people. And so I think what Consortium News is doing, what these vigils are doing, are so important because it sets the table for where we're going to have to go with this Assange case. And people should know that it's going to take a movement to protect Julian Assange. It's not going to happen without people power standing up for him, because the power structure is opposed to him. And that's why there's been such an effort at character assassination to make Julian Assange someone you're not allowed to like, to make him into a sex abuser, make him into a Trump fan. All this character assassination has been intentionally done to prevent a movement from growing to support who I think is the most important journalist of the 21st century, because he's broken through and democratized the media. I'll stop there.
Well, I don't think there's any hyperbole in what you've said in pointing out that this is truly an historic press freedom case. That is right up there with John Peter Zenger, which was in colonial America.
That's right.
The British governor of New York prosecuted him for writing something that he didn't like about himself. And the jury nullified the case. They recognized that the law at the time allowed the governor general to prosecute a printer, in that case, of printing something against the government, but they said they didn't agree with the law, and that was the foundation later for our press freedoms. And now maybe we've come full circle in the Julian Assange case. He would be probably the first major case that we know of anyway, of a journalist being prosecuted in North America since John Peter Zenger. That was 300 years ago.
That's right. And Zenger's defense was he published the truth.
Yep.
And that was not even allowed as a defense in those days.
Correct.
If you were saying something bad about the government, about the king, you were guilty. It didn't matter. And so that just was and that's kind of what Bob Barr just said, in his testimony. If it's not good for the government, we're going to prosecute him. Well, that's exactly what the Zenger case was about. So it's a reversal of 300 years of press freedom.
One of the reasons for the revolution is reversing it, going back to colonial British government thinking.
Now, Zenger was lucky to be able to get a jury that would nullify. That's a rarity. Jury nullification is, jurors are not instructed on their right to say the law is wrong. They're instructed to follow the facts as presented in court. And as you talked about earlier with David, often the reason someone does something is not allowed in that evidence. But jury nullification is not common. And I can tell you, in Alexandria, Virginia, where this case would likely be prosecuted, the jury would be made up of people who work at the Pentagon, their spouses, their children, their friends, people who work for military contractors, work for intelligence agencies, their spouses and children and friends. This will not be a jury that's likely to nullify. And so that Alexandria court is used for these kinds of cases for a reason, because it almost guarantees a conviction. There's no way that Assange would get a fair trial in Alexandria, Virginia, in that Fourth Circuit in Virginia.
Yeah. And, you talked about the media. Why is the corporate media opposed to him so strongly now when, they did profit by getting scoops from him? It helped their profits in terms of money as well. And as Ray McGovern, who we're going to talk to in a minute, wrote from our publication about a speech that the number 2 general counsel of the New York Times gave out to some judges on the West Coast a couple of months ago, which he said, we don't like Assange, or we don't want him prosecuted, because if they go after him, they can go after us because we're doing the same thing he does, which is to publish classified information.
I'll tell you why they don't like. I'll tell you why they don't like him. There's a fight going on right now in the media between the corporate media, which is losing credibility. People don't trust it. The polls show it's just not trusted, and the independent people's media. And that's growing in popularity. People trust their friends. They trust people like Ray McGovern and Bill Binney and others who, are truth tellers, but don't get covered in the media, the corporate media. And that battle between the corporate media and the people's media, Julian Assange is right in the center of that, because he's empowering the people's media. He's empowering a democratized media. And the corporate media is threatened. Newspaper readership is down. Cable TV news media down. They're not being watched. They're not being believed. And something like WikiLeaks empowers people like us who, our website, popularresistance.org, covers the movement, the people's movement on a variety of fronts that the media doesn't cover. And so someone like Julian Assange empowers all of us, empowers consortium news, because that is an avenue for democratized media, for people's media, and the commercial media is very afraid of that.
Absolutely. And the government, again, previously was afraid to prosecute. The Obama administration called it, they wanted to go after Assange. They looked into it. They called it their New York Times problem. They knew that if they prosecuted WikiLeaks, the Times could be liably prosecuted. I see Sam Husseini is about to join us, and he could talk more about that bar, but he's not online yet. So let me bring in Bill Binney, if you don't mind, Ray. I'll bring Bill in first. Bill, unmute your microphone, please. Yes. Okay. Bill, of course, was a former technical director of the National Security Agency, a very senior official there, and one of the best mathematicians, it is said, that ever worked at the NSA. Bill, if you want to just weigh in on anything that's been said so far, I'm sure you have something to say.
Well, I just see this whole thing as a move by the shadow government of our country and the deep state, all of those who have vested interest in perpetual wars and things of that nature, trying to get rid of truth across the board so they can spin a narrative and manipulate the people of the country any way they want. Case in point is with for example, the alleged visit by Manafort into see Julian. That of course is just a simple attempt at connecting Julian with the Trump campaign, and that in turn with an allegation of working with the Russians because they fed the data into Julian. So that would give them grounds for impeaching him and getting rid of him, because he is actually a potential disruptor of this entire program that I call it the happiness management program, where lots of people make lots of money, but a lot of the people who are not part of what I call the Department of Just Us, meaning there's certain people who are given credit for like Hillary, when she was excused from all kinds of crimes, right? Because she was Hillary and a member of the Department of Just Us. The rest of us, poor suckers, are not. We just take it in the back side, But so I would point out, though, that there's some things that people here aren't talking about because they're inconvenient regulations in government. For example, if you're talking about whistleblowers are required by working for the government to report fraud, waste, abuse, and corruption. That's a requirement for them to have employment with the government. But when you do that, then the agencies that they work for come down and hammer them. And that's a violation of other regulations covering whistleblower protection. except in the intelligence community. That's where the exceptions are. But I would also show and say that for example, when Edward Snowden published or released all of that material to be published on the spying programs of the NSA, that gave me the opportunity to read into the court record in a sworn affidavit all of those charts and things that related to a lot of the spying capabilities I work and developed for NSA. It allowed me to read that into a sworn affidavit where it's basically swearing that these agencies are violating the constitutional rights of the United States citizens. And so I did that. And so the government, their tactic is they've got to keep me out of court and out of testifying, because then it will be on the record and somebody will have to address it. And that's what they don't want to do. They don't want to address all the crimes they've been committing in public forum. And so my objective is to push that, just like Julian does, try to push the truth out so that people in the country have at least some basis of making some reasonable decision based on knowledge of what's really going on, not this hidden agenda that the people are spewing at them. It's like they're treating them like, I call it like Pavlov's dogs, because they're just repeating things over and over again from many different directions and expecting everybody to believe it without challenging any of it. And that's really where I find the objective. Like, for example, the allegation that the DNC emails were hacked by somebody in Russia. Well, some of the people who are looking at the data now are finding what is called FAT32 format, which is file allocation table format. That's a format used to index data on a storage device, which means it implies that those data, that DNC data, was taken down onto a thumb drive or some other storage device that was attached to the computer. So, that's another fabrication that these people are putting forth. I would also argue that in some of the cases, like in the Manning case and in the case of Edward Snowden and others who are releasing classified information and publishing it, there's another regulation that people are also ignoring, and that's the Executive Order 13526, which covers all classification of material in the U.S. government. Section 1.7 of that says that you cannot classify, maintain classified, or not declassify material if it is evidence of a crime, fraud, waste, abuse, corruption, embarrassment to a person or an agency, and several other things. But the point is, a lot of the material that was published from Edward Snowden and also from Manning there were evidence of a crime. The Collateral Murder movie was a straightforward war crime. Those are crimes that people should be prosecuted for. And by those regulations that govern classification for the U.S. government, they must be declassified. And so therefore, there's no real violation of anybody's right. And besides all the things that have been discussed, I have not seen any damage to their capability to do any kind of intelligence analysis anywhere in the world. So when they publish stuff that, we're looking at emails and phone calls and so on, well, everybody knew that already. There's no surprise to that. The terrorists have known that all along. The fact that it was being done was kept from the U.S. public because they didn't want the U.S. public to know that they were a part of this spying program. The idea that they don't have the capability to do it is just nonsense. We had the capability to do that in 1999. All we had to do was have space and power, and we could collect everything in the world. There was nothing to limit us to do it. And we had done the development to sessionize material up the fiber networks and in the World Wide Web. And certainly the capacity to tap all the phones was already there. It was just a matter of having space and power and equipment to do it. And that was not a problem for us at the time. And it certainly isn't a problem for them now. So all of this is really a fabrication to keep everybody ignorant, uninformed, and just so you'll follow the instructions from those in power.
Thank you, Bill. I hope you stick around now. I'm going to bring in Sam Husseini, but in a minute, but I want to read a bulletin that just came out to add to the headlines. This is from the Defense Assange campaign, a tweet. It says 3 British undercover police have just stopped and demanded ID from one of Mr. Assange's legal team exiting the embassy. At least 2 undercover cars are currently staking out the embassy in shifts, together with police surveillance cameras implanted on opposing buildings. So this is a kind of new an ominous development here. That one of the lawyers have always had the right, as far as I understand, even after Ecuador cut off Julian Assange's access to visit him. Now the British police are demanding ID from part of his legal team. Now, Sam Husseini, Sam, at the beginning, I read some headlines and I finished with I read your entire IPA statement in which you quote Bob Barr's testimony and then Floyd Abrams' response. So tell us about how you got onto that and what you make of all that.
Well, I noticed, what Barr said, that basically, the nominee for Attorney General is basically putting out a line that the standard should be if it harms the nation, if it hurts the country, that should somehow be the standard for whether or not a journalist is prosecuted. And I found this an extraordinary statement coming from somebody who's coming in to be Attorney General. It's beyond saying, I think it goes beyond some of what we've heard about against WikiLeaks from prior government officials, that it's classified information, and they're colluding with people who are breaking the law by, violating their service of the government and so on, which in itself is highly dubious, but it seemed to even go beyond that. And I started poking around, and there's very few people were speaking out against this. WikiLeaks actually did on their Twitter feed, I noticed, and Matt Taibbi did. But other than that, I found a remarkable silence among people with a substantial platform. I emailed the Press Freedom Committee that I'm on the email list for at the Press Club here. I'm a member of the National Press Club. And they didn't seem eager to do it, although a member of the Committee to Protect Journalists noted that they had put out a very mild statement eventually on the matter. I got the bright idea, actually, at the suggestion of Francis Boyle, a very critical, very important law professor at the University of Illinois, to perhaps reach out to Floyd Abrams, who I had thought of but didn't think of actually approaching him. Floyd Abrams is regarded as the leading expert on the First Amendment in the United States. He represented the New York Times in the Pentagon Papers lawsuit. And I was very delighted that he got back to me with the statement saying that Barr's comments are deeply threatening to the First Amendment norms in general and journalistic freedom in particular, which I thought was a fairly strong statement. And we put it out on social media where it got a fair amount of pickup. And then I did put out a news release. That's what we do. My day job is with the Institute for Public Accuracy, so we put out critical news releases, hopefully on timely subjects. So we blasted this out literally to thousands upon thousands of media professionals. I just did a Google News search, and nobody's picked it up, which is kind of remarkable. I mean, when several months ago, when Floyd Abrams, the same First Amendment scholar, weighed in on the side of Acosta, CNN's reporter, when the White House was barring him from going to the White House, it got picked up by tons and tons of media outlets when he weighed in on that subject. But here, it's the same person, it's the same definitive authority on the First Amendment, weighing in on the critical factor of a pending nominee for Attorney General, setting a arguably very onerous standard about the First Amendment. It has gotten no media pickup. I managed to get the librarian here at the Press Club to do a Nexus search. As of yesterday, nobody's picked it up. She's said she's going to do another one for me. But according to, Google News, and of course that's a biased thing too, because Google gets to pick what what qualifies in its cachet of what's news websites and what's not. So that might be a skewed realm as well. So it's, I think it's a critical comment, a very dangerous comment from Barr that obviously threatens WikiLeaks, and eventually I think will threaten a lot of media outlets who have any intent on doing critical reporting. And it's remarkable that there's media silence about Abrams' critique of it.
That was the word unspoken in the testimony. The name Julian Assange or WikiLeaks did not come up at all, did it? But it sounds like, yeah.
Go ahead.
Sounds like the media recognizes who he was talking about, which is why they haven't touched the story and hasn't appeared anywhere, right?
Possibly. I think that's part of it. I think that the sort of personal animus against Assange perhaps leads perhaps some people in corporate media to go along with these onerous standards, but you'd think that some of them would realize that eventually it's going to go beyond that if it's allowed. He didn't say that there are media outlets and then there are media outlets, or he didn't do anything like that. He outright said, if a journalist harms the country, then we might go after them.
Yeah. Sam, I hope you could stick around because I'm going to bring in Ray, and I want to open this up to as freewheeling a discussion as possible. Your thoughts, Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst and frequent visitor to the Vigil. Can't hear you, Ray. You're muted, Ray. Unmute your mic, please.
All right.
There you go.
Work now?
Yes, it does.
My wife often says she'd like me to mute, but
you mean your mouth? You mean? Okay.
No, this is a good crew, Joe, and thanks for inviting me. I have a couple of thoughts here relevant to what's been said before. One has to ask, why do they hate Julian Assange? Well, there's collateral murder. There's all that stuff from Afghanistan, Iraq, the diplomatic cables. But take it from me, the real reason they hate Julian Assange is because he has this bizarre ability to get leaks still. And that's why they call it, I think, WikiLeaks. And what's a leak? That's something, as Bill Binney has it described, not something you put on the internet, not something you put on the web or on the network. It's something you download from a computer and you get it to, if not Julian Assange, then one of his lieutenants, okay? So if that's the case, and if that's how Julian Assange got not only the Democratic National Committee emails, which, let's face it, were pristine, pure documentary evidence that Hillary and the DNC stacked the deck against what's his name? Come on, you guys. Who? Bernie Sanders. Okay. So they were damaging, and I'm the last one to suggest that they would not have hurt Hillary Clinton, but they were the truth. So that's one thing. Now, how did Julian Assange get Vault 7? My God, Vault 7. For those of you who don't know about Vault 7, this is an array of computer tools that were developed with NSA, Bill's old friends, and CIA types at a huge cost. Vault 7 has 700 million lines of code. Now, I was on my way to an interview one time, and I was going to talk about this, and I had the presence of mind to call Bill Binney. I said, Bill, 700 million lines of code, that sounds like a lot, Bill. And Bill says, well, yeah. He says, Ray, you history majors, I tell you. He says, look, can you still do multiplication? I said, yeah. He says, well, multiply $25 by 700 million. That's what this program costs, okay? So you're up in the billions. I haven't done the math recently and I forget. Anyhow, that got to Julian Assange. These were the family jewels. Julian announced that this treasure trove was more consequential and more comprehensive than all the stuff Ed Snowden brought out into Hong Kong. That's big. Does Julian exaggerate? I haven't seen him exaggerate this kind of thing. So what happened? In March of 2017 is when Julian announced that he had yet another leak from an inside CIA source, whether it was a staffer or whether it was a contractor. We were not sure at the time. I'm still not sure. And he said that this was very damaging because it released all these very fancy tools developed by Bill Binney's old folks or developed by CIA with the help of Binney's old folks who really have the expertise. And the first thing we learned on the 7th of March, 2017, was one of these tools allowed the CIA or someone else to take control of a car and make it go 120 miles an hour and kill somebody. Okay. Ooh, that was fancy. That was sexy. And the New York Times published that. Same time, there was a tool that allows you to arrange a TV in such a way that you turn it off, but guess what? It's still on. And as you go to bed and whatever you do in your bedroom, everything is recorded. Everything goes back to whoever wanted to load this stuff. Now, here's the point. At the end of March, on the 31st of March, they released a new tool, and it was called Marble Framework, actually. And this was sometimes the CIA uses 35-cent words. It enabled the CIA to obfuscate, okay? You could hack into a system, hack into a computer or a server, and obfuscate who hacked in and make it appear that it was somebody other than you. Now, Bill and I thought, that's pretty curious. I wonder if could it be that the breadcrumbs that were left on some of these metadata, could it be that the name of the first chief of the Cheka, the forerunner of the KGB, was named, his name and patronymic? Could it be that those breadcrumbs were left not by careless professional Russians, but by John Brennan or Admiral Rogers or this little group, thousands of people, a whole new directorate set up by John Brennan, head of the CIA 5 years ago. So this Marble Framework thing was really poison. So much so that the New York Times looked at it and said, oh my God, better talk to the White House, so talk to the CIA. They said, no, don't publish that. Don't publish that. Anyway, the New York Times didn't publish it after having published the other stuff, okay? Now, fortunately for Washington Post readers, Ellen Nakashima, fairly good journalist, although, anyhow, she didn't get the memo. She didn't get the word from on high that she would not to write the story of it. So she wrote a terrific headline, released by WikiLeaks, blows secret CIA plan to hack in, okay? So it's out there. She pointed out that they worked in 5 languages: Russian, Chinese, Persian, Arabic, and Korean. So it's not a stretch of the imagination. We historians or we all source analysts like to connect dots, so to speak. And, if you're looking for who might have hacked into the DNC and left these little breadcrumbs, well, Bill can speak for himself, but it's not a leap. It's not a logical leap to suggest that if it wasn't the Russians, and we're pretty convinced it wasn't, it was somebody with the capability to do this and to obfuscate who did it. A little footnote here, the CIA tool had built into it a de-obfuscator, so they could always have the original, okay? Now, why am I saying all that? I'm saying all that because Julian Assange, if he doesn't exaggerate, which he doesn't, he's got a pile of stuff from Vault 7. He may have released one bombshell, namely Marble Framework, but there's lots more. Now, do I know that? I just know that as an all-source analyst, just looking at at what he said and what he did so far. Now, Julian, according to a report by a very good reporter, John Solomon told me one time that he looked up to Bob Perry as the consummate reporter, investigative journalist. And Bob is good, but John Solomon is equally good. He writes for The Hill. So he came up with this information that the CIA was so upset about this that they got a lawyer from the Justice Department. His name was Laufman. He was been on the TV lately. His name is Laufman, okay? And they said, look, Justice Department, by the way, does the CIA's bidding on such things. He said, look, talk to Assange's lawyer. Can't we work out something that, where Assange could at least make sure that really sensitive stuff to get people in trouble, or, so took to Julian's lawyer. Julian's lawyer talked to him, and they say, hey, this was in March 2017. And they were very close to a deal. The two lawyers, and what Julian said was, I'd like some sort of free passage for this, and besides, I can tell you who it was that didn't hack. In other words, this big celebre, I can tell you who it was that didn't hack. So these naive lawyers, okay, Laufman for the DOJ, I could just see what happened. He's talked to his buddies there in the DOJ and say, oh, wow, you know what? Senator Warner from Virginia, my senator, he would be very interested in this because he's really interested in Russian hacking. And Laufman, I can't believe it. I guess, he watches CNN. He gets in touch with Senator Mark Warner. And he says, Senator Warner, we have a deal going here, and we thought you might be interested. And Julian Assange is going to tell us who didn't do it, who didn't hack in. And Warner says, oh, that's very well. I'll be back to you. He calls Comey. Comey was still the FBI director. And Comey says, my God, turn that thing off. Turn those contacts off. Warner comes back and tells Laufman, it's off. Don't talk to Julian Assange anymore. Well, that it's pretty transparent that if I have to explain it, of course, that Senator Mark Warner and James Comey had constructed this edifice of the Russiagate. And if Julian Assange would give us tangible proof that Russia didn't do it, that's the last thing they wanted. Now, Julian got really ticked off, according to this report from John Solomon. And he said, all right, that's it. I'm going to release one of the worst, and that was how Marble Framework came out. Now, I know I'm talking so long, but let me just finish up here. So they hate him for that, and they know he's got more. Now, they can't go after him on First Amendment grounds. They can't. I mean, the New York Times is mealy-mouthed, and they don't say anything. But I think one reason they don't is because they know that this would be a bridge too far to cross. So what's the explanation? And the explanation is they want to get him on espionage. How do they do that? Well, first they write this blue carding thing with a generous contribution from the National Endowment for Democracy. That's incredible. That story needs to get out. I hadn't heard that before. And then they say, oh, Paul Manafort was there 3 or 4 times. And of course, there's no evidence he was, but that sticks, right? That sticks in the public imagination. And then now, if DOJ, it's the FBI, no doubt, is talking to the help, okay, the Ecuadorian people who were hired in the security, I've been there. I know who these guys, some of them are private security firms. They can find out things. Oh, just like the CIA found out things from the people who we either bribed or tortured about Saddam Hussein, right? So they can get these people and suborn them and say, hey, we got a lot of pounds we can give you. If you could just remember, don't you remember Manafort? Here's a picture. Don't you remember seeing him in there? So it's so crass. That is my idea of what they're trying to do. Bottom line, I don't think there's any chance that they think they get away, even in these circumstances, even with Barr saying the things that he does, with going after Julian Assange for being a publisher. But they can go after if they can construct a case saying he took active measures to get these Russians to give him the stuff and all that kind of stuff. It's going to be tough to do that, but Mueller's hard at work. He's been at it for over a year and a half now. Is he going to come up empty-handed? Is he going to say, "Oh no, we couldn't find anything," just like Bob Woodward did after he wrote that book? No, Mueller's not going to do that. So what's Mueller going to do? He's going to get the proceeds from the interrogations of these helpers at the Ecuadorian embassy. And he's going to get some other stuff from the old friends of John Brennan, sort of evidence like weapons of mass destruction, just as reliable. And my view is that there's an even chance that Mueller will construct some kind of case based on falsified information. The only deterrent from that, the only deterrent he has would be if he knew that there were one or two honest lawyers left in the Department of Justice. Now, I hope there are, but I don't know. Looking lately, I don't know if there are. But if Mueller feels that he can't trust people to be dishonest, then this would really string him up bad. So that would be a deterrent. I guess the chances that I weigh them are 50-50 that Mueller will come up with spurious intelligence and say, "Aha, we got him." Collusion, or he's going to say, "Well, we don't have much, but we do have these terrible crimes about commercial fraud and all that kind of stuff." These are all crooks up in New York anyway. Big deal. Yawn, yawn. So I've talked enough, but those are my thoughts at present. Thank you.
Unmute yourself, Joe. Unmute yourself, Joe.
Joe, unmute yourself.
I'm usually the one giving that instruction. So here we go. I guess I got it back now. Yeah, the other defense could be if Assange's team were allowed to have a defense and ask discovery. And if they ever got into a courtroom, this indictment, like Mueller's indictment of the GRU agents, will never go into a courtroom. That's why he could say whatever he wants in it. I want to open it up.
Something when you get done.
Yes. Bill, 1 second before you do. I just want to read one more quick bulletin here that Ecuador's, we just talked before about how one of Assange's lawyers was asked for ID by British police coming out of the embassy. And now we've learned that Ecuador's ambassador to the UK has denied access to Assange today by the Frontline Club founder Vaughan Smith, celebrated ABC News journalist and former Taliban hostage Sean Langan, and Ecuador's former consul to the UK, Fidel Navieres, all made applications to see him this week, and the Ecuadorian government said no. So they are allowing some visitors, but not others, including the founder of the Frontline Club, which is kind of like the press club where Sam Husseini is, or just disappeared from, in London. So, Bill, please weigh in.
Oh. Yeah, I was going to comment on the Mueller indictment that Rosenstein announced. Of the, excuse me, of the GRU agents. He was indicting them spies for being spies, but he was using DC leaks and Lucifer 2 as the basic founding evidence to look at. Well, we could prove forensically that not only was the Lucifer 2 data not a hack that went across the Atlantic, we could prove that. We could also prove that he was manipulating the data and therefore fabricating the data. So he used, Rosenstein and Mueller were using fabricated information to concoct an indictment, which is also a fabrication. And so, it's all this false, that's the way they're trying to manipulate evidence or create evidence to try to get rid of Trump or anybody that, Julian, or anybody that's potentially disruptive to the deep state and the shadow government. They don't want the truth about anything out there. And so they're doing these kinds of fabrications. And this is the Department of Just Us operating, where it's Mueller, Comey, and all those McCabe and all those people were part of it.
Yeah, unfortunately, Sam, Kevin Zeese left us. I wanted to bring him into this discussion, but he did write on the chat panel here before he left that his sense was that if Assange is prosecuted, it will be as an accomplice to leaking classified documents, not for publishing, but for an accomplice to the leak. I think that's what Ray was getting at, where they'd have to prove that he instructed someone to steal a document and then give it to us. And Bob Perry, by the way, wrote about this maybe 5-6 years ago, in which he talked about how journalists often very much encourage their sources to give them stuff. So where's the line between encouraging a source and finessing them and trying to get them to get that one more extra document, please, that I need so I can really nail down the story, and telling them to commit a crime? So in Assange's case, that fine distinction might not be so important to the prosecutors. Yes, Ray. Oh, we got Brian Becker in here. Brian, you want to, before we bring Ray back in here, because you did have quite a bit of time on the floor, Ray, if you don't mind, I want to welcome Brian Becker, who's the host of Loud and Clear. Brian, I don't know how much of this conversation you heard, if any. We were talking about some of the headlines that I read at the beginning, and one of them was that, well, first of all, we saw Bob, we have Sam Hosseini here because Sam was able to get Floyd Abrams to weigh in on this extraordinary statement that was made by Barr during his testimony to become Attorney General. I'm trying to get it in front of me. He said, Barr, it's one thing to say that there could be circumstances in which a journalist need to protect her. No, that's Abrams' statement. I'm sorry. Basically, Barr said that he could conceive of situations where, as a last resort, where news organizations run through a red flag, something like that, and knows that they're putting out stuff that will hurt the country. There could be a situation where a journalist, could be held in contempt. That was an answer to the question by Senator Klobuchar about whether the Justice Department would ever jail reporters for doing their jobs. Brian, you want to weigh in on that and anything else about what's going on and how you see the situation of Julian Assange right now?
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I didn't hear the earlier conversation. I just came in for the last comments by Bill Binney, but I did see Barr's comments. And of course, what is the red flag? What's the red line or the red flag, and who determines it? I mean, wait a second. What about the First Amendment? I mean, and we have at the same moment that Bill Barr, the architect of mass incarceration in the United States, someone who loves to put people in prison, and lots of them. And as you can see in his document that he authored in 1992, the case for mass incarceration in the United States. I mean, that's who this person is. In his testimony, he says, "Yeah, I can see us arresting journalists. Sure. Well, in fact, Marzia Hashimi, the African American woman who was a well-known anchor for the press TV show, The Debate, a show that probably many of us have been on frequently, certainly more than once. She stopped in LA, as she does every year on Sunday, to visit her family in St. Louis, and to also make a documentary about Black Lives Matter in St. Louis. And of course, St. Louis is just a little bit away from Ferguson, where Mike Brown was killed, that inaugurated the Black Lives Matter movement. She's arrested. And the day after, the FBI says, well, we have unspecified charges, or that's what the media was saying. Well, she doesn't have any charges. She's arrested as a material witness. And we know how Robert Mueller played that after 9/11, where literally thousands of people who were either Arab American or South Asian or Muslims or looked like they were South Asian or looked like they were Arab, they were arrested as material witnesses, and thus denied all the fundamental rights of an arrestee for an arraignment and to face their accuser and to know the charges, because there actually are no charges. So this is happening right now. This is happening because, of course, Press TV is a target. Julian Assange is a target for a different reason. Press TV is a target because it's part of the state media for Iran, and Iran is in the crosshairs of the Trump administration. Julian is in the crosshairs because he tells the truth. WikiLeaks has never published anything that's not true. And so when you have the Attorney General coming in and saying, oh, yeah, I can conceive of arresting journalists and holding them sort of vaguely about red flags and maybe for contempt for maybe other things, you can't but interpret this as a signal of what the mood and temperament of the government is right now. And of course, it's not Trump only, it's not Barr only. This is across the board. That's why I think what we're doing here is, in fact, critically important, because we are not beholden to either of these parties. We're not part of that establishment. We're not part of these elites. But I think we do speak for the majority of people in the world, and certainly the majority of people who even read about WikiLeaks revelations through, say, The Guardian or The Washington Post or The New York Times. We value this information. Not only do we value it, but we learn about a government that speaks in our name and is committing crimes against humanity, like the crimes that WikiLeaks revealed in the Iraq war logs. This is indispensable information. So we're up against it right now. We all know we're up against it. Julian Assange is up against it more than anybody. But I actually feel that given the time and the mood and the temperament within this country and amongst the law enforcement, that they feel that they're untethered. They don't have any restraints right now. Anything goes right now. All the more reason why what we're doing is in fact critically important.
Absolutely, Brian. Thank you for that. Anybody want to weigh in? Just a free discussion now.
I'd like to weigh in briefly just on, there's the immediate threat against Julian. And I'd like to just pull back and see how much this has all cost us. We talk about the cost of the Iraq war. There's the direct cost of something like the Iraq war, the disaster, the humanitarian disaster, the expense, and so on. And then there's missed opportunity costs. And them going after WikiLeaks and Julian over the last several years has had such enormous missed opportunity costs. Like, they pulled the plug when WikiLeaks was most prominent, when they put out the collateral murder videotape and so on. They pulled the plug on their financing. They could have gotten a ton of money at that point. And the state, led by Joe Lieberman, in cahoots with the credit card companies, pulled the plug on what could have been a groundswell of financing for independent media. And now, they've got him on the legal ropes forever and ever, hauled up. Julian, several years ago, quite prophetically, wrote a book, Google is not what it seems. And I suspect, I don't know, I'm not in close contact with him as other folks here are. I think he had his eyes set on challenging the internet giants, of not simply continuing to do incredible work in terms of getting these leaks out, but also the very structure of how we communicate nationally and globally is now dominated by Google and Facebook and Twitter, a new generation of monopolies. And I think that WikiLeaks could have been in a position to challenge that in a substantial way. And that enormous missed opportunity costs has been there. Right now, the independent media, meaningful independent media, is a bare bones operation, which is part of the reason you've seen the rise of things like RT and Press TV and so on that are connected with governments that are sometimes at variance with the U.S. establishment. And it's important that those are there, but we saw the dangers of that in terms of Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera was supposed to be, the answer, whatever it was 10 years ago. And, because they are a part of the apparatus of, the Qatari regime, there are obvious limitations of that. However, important and, great some of the journalistic work that comes out of any one of these establishments are. WikiLeaks could have been the foundation and could have been a wellspring of financing for that kind of independent media and independent social media on a global scale. And that opportunity at a critical point in the development of the internet and human communications has been eviscerated by the actions of the state in going after WikiLeaks when they did.
Anyone want to jump in?
End of rant.
Yeah, we need a new rant. Go ahead, Ray. You're on.
Yeah, we talked before Sam came on, before Brian came on, about WikiLeaks and Guccifer 2.0. And it was mentioned that the 12 apostles, not 12 apostles, the 12 GRU folks that were apparently taken out of the GRU phone book and indicted just like ham sandwiches for spying. That was based largely on material from Guccifer 2. And Bill has already pointed out that there's a problem with that. So I'd ask Bill, do you have any clues as, who is this Lucifer to? I mean, who is this? We're non-sexist in referring to Lucifer to, whether it's a he, she, or it. What is it? Bill, do you have any thoughts? Who could it be?
Well, of course, you and I have discussed this, Ray. If you summed up all the evidence that you can point to as evidence, that there are telltale signs of who did it in the supposedly the shadow broker output or whatever it is, and if you looked at all the fabrication that we can show with Guccifer 2 and some of the stumbling and bumbling and the speed and stuff like that, it's the standard bumbling that people would do when they're not really that talented in doing these kinds of things, which really smacks like your special department down there at CIA. So, the whole thing is a fabrication anyway. I just say we should ignore all of that. I mean, but I also wanted to point out one of the earlier discussions where we were talking about the things, the lost opportunities. One of the other consequences, and we need to really, is really being missed by the U.S. public. One of the consequences of the actions that our government took to react to 9/11 is that they've basically done and achieved against our own country what the terrorists wanted to happen but could never do by themselves. So we have done to ourselves what they wanted done, but that they could never achieve. And so we've corrupted our own process. We are destroying our own democracy. Our republic is going down the drain because of the actions of our own government. And I believe that we should have a clean slate. If Barr says he doesn't have any problem with putting a lot of people in jail, well, there's a lot of them down there in D.C. who aren't following the law, and there's a lot of them down there who need to go there. And if Barr starts to say that, well, then let him start doing it.
Destroying all of that on hype threats and a hype threat of terrorism, and certainly a hype threat of Russia. And we've been through that before, haven't we? I mean, yes. It's only natural that if there was McCarthyism with the first Cold War, there's going to be a McCarthyism with the second Cold War. And that's what we're living through right now. And Julian Assange is right at the heart of it. Yes?
And they're lining us up to give more money to the Department of Defense for this Russian military threat, Mm-hmm. So this is the whole idea of the new Cold War. It's going to cost a few more $1 trillion. And that was the whole idea. They wanted to swindle it out of the public, keep them stupid and uninformed so they don't know what's going on, and they'll just follow along like sheep. Who's got the bell?
That was the whole idea of the first Cold War.
Exactly.
Bomber gap, missile gap, all of this found out to be total exaggerations. And but it made a lot of money for people that Eisenhower warned us about. And they're making a lot of money for people today, a lot more money than they made then. But there's a new McCarthyism that, as I say, Assange is a key part of that because they have to shut him down. And they're also shutting down alternative media that has been existent before RT or Sputnik or any of the Russian English language media existed. There have been people critical of American foreign policy. But suddenly when we are writing that kinds of journalists like that are writing the same kind of criticism, we're now somehow puppets of Russia, as if we couldn't have thought of that of ourselves. It's very insulting. So to smear Russia for any kind of criticism of their actions, the rulers and leaders of our country, whether that be economic and the unrest that's growing around the world, and including inside the U.S., it's got to be blamed on a foreign power. The yellow vests, of course, were stirred up by Russia. All of this nonsense. And there are new controls on media. NewsGuard is this organization that's calling alternative media like Mint Press and questioning them as if they have subpoena power on behalf of the government, and they're just a private organization, but very much maybe on behalf of government, who could never do that. You can have the Justice Department call an operation, a small place like Mint Press, start asking them about their finances and why they do that. So we're in a really horrible environment. Brian or Ray?
Yeah, I just wanted to note something here. I've been throwing away a lot of papers trying to get downsized. And I uncovered some comments by this fellow, Robert Mueller, who's been in the news lately. And he was complaining to Congress that if we only could have this dragnet surveillance system, maybe 9/11 could have been prevented. Huh? Okay, it's Mueller talking about that, knowing full well that NSA did have that stuff, okay, and could have prevented it if it weren't for the indignities in the system. Now, why do I mention that? I think this is an aspect that Americans need to know, and they don't. And I don't know how you do it, but this is what they need to know. 9/11 could have been prevented if WikiLeaks was up and running in those days. Now, that's a big statement, right? How do I know that? Well, I know that because Colleen Rowley, the division counsel in the Minneapolis Bureau of the FBI, and Bogdan Zakovich. Now, most people don't know Bogdan Zakovich. It's not a household name, but it should be. He led the red teams that sought to enter airfields, airports, aircraft with bomb-like substances. He was an FAA super sleuth, and his team was crackerjack. And 8 out of 10 times, they completely succeeded in getting whatever bomb-like material they wanted onto these planes. And he was up in arms because he couldn't get his superiors to work on it. And, you know, the Israelis, they have doors on the cockpits that cost $187 a door, for God's sake, you know. So he was out of his gourd. He was just as upset, more upset than Colleen Rowley. And of course, when it happened, you know, he was disconsolate. Now, he was asked, Bogdan, if WikiLeaks were in existence then, if you could have leaked that information to WikiLeaks, do you think that would you have done that? And he said, yeah, for sure I would. And then we asked Colleen, and Colleen talked to her special agents in the Minneapolis division. And there were several that were pulling their hair out because headquarters FBI would not give them permission to even go into Moussawi's computer, for God's sake, you know? And we asked them, well, now, so we were allowed to do that. We probably would have made an announcement. The whole thing would have been called off because we had one of the guys, one of the pilots, one of the maybe co-pilots or reserve pilot. So would you have gone to WikiLeaks? And these people worked together with Colleen, said, yeah, we would have. So what does it mean? Well, actually, they did an op-ed for the Los Angeles Times, and the Los Angeles Times published it. The title was something, What If? Okay. So these are two people that were in the trenches. They saw what was coming. They were terribly upset by being dissed by the powers that be, and would have gone to WikiLeaks, and 9/11 would have presumably, almost certainly, been prevented. So now that's not a hard story to tell. You probably don't need as many words as I just used, but Americans need to know that. And if they knew that, and if they knew that NSA had the information anyway, well, they should be held to pay. Trick, as usual, is to get that into the media in such a way that American people can learn about it, and the just us people will not be able to prevent them from learning about it. That's
well, I wonder, Ray, if WikiLeaks existed in 2002, early 2003, if the invasion of Iraq may have been delayed somehow by the release of the. I mean, there was that one memo, the Downing Street memo, that was released, and talk about painting coalition aircraft white to make it look like a UN plane and things like that. And of course, the great memo of they were fitting the evidence to the goal, which was the invasion.
The Downing Street thing, yeah.
We wonder what we could have done then.
The intelligence, yeah.
Brian, if I could turn attention to what's going on outside the embassy right now. I don't know if you heard these two bulletins that I announced. One was that a lawyer for Julian Assange leaving the embassy just a few hours ago was stopped and asked for ID by British police. And there were two unmarked cars there continuing their surveillance, which is something I've not heard of before, is threatening and ominous. And then on the same day, there was a request put in because the Ecuadorian government has opened up a window here of visitors. We've had John Pilger going twice to see Julian Assange in the last month. Cassandra Fairbanks was there. Angela Richter, a theater director, went to see him. And now the founder of the Frontline Club, which is a press club, a media club in London, Vaughn Smith, and an ABC News journalist and former Taliban hostage, Sean Langan, as well as Ecuador's former consul to the UK. I think this would be the reason why, in my opinion. Fidel Navarez. He was the head of the consulate while Julian was there, but no longer is because we have this new horrible government in Ecuador. They were all denied the application to see Assange. The three of them were going in, or at least, I don't know if they're going in together, but the three of them were denied that. What does this tell you, Brian, about what's happening around there? Anything?
Well, I mean, we don't know with specificity. We do know that we're in a stage now where the government and the coercive institutions that have power and have authority are using their power and their authority to create a sense of inevitability, a sense of doom or a sense of gloom based on their inevitable power being the ultimate determiner of the outcome or of the fate of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And I think this is an extremely important element of psychological warfare, which is critically important in the powers that be efforts to succeed, because there's an asymmetrical conflict going on in the political sense. We, the people who are on this webinar and the people who have been coming together every day and every week and every month over and over and over again, don't command institutional power. We don't have vast resources behind us. We may have public opinion behind us, although public opinion, if it's sympathetic but still passive, isn't that powerful. If it's sympathetic and mobilized, it can be the power. So I think what the signals that are being sent right now with the denial of visitors, the stopping of journalists coming out of the embassy, credentialing them, stopping and frisking them essentially in a way, it's an effort to wear the movement down. And again, to create this sense of inevitability. Inevitability under these circumstances is our enemy. If the assumption is that all the power rests on one side and thus that power will succeed, then it has the effect of disempowering people who want to do something to make a difference. And that's critically important, the psychological element. And I think the powers that be know well about this, because these are institutional powers that have a great deal of experience about how to succeed in public opinion and to manipulate public opinion in a way that makes the possibility of an organized public opinion, which is a great power, seemingly remote. So yeah, what we're experiencing and what WikiLeaks is experiencing, what Julian Assange in particular is experiencing, is a psychological assault based on applying more and more pressure. And under conditions of more and more pressure, if the pressure is not relieved, or if there isn't a sense of growing momentum of support, it's designed to have a wearing down impact on people. That's why I think that we have to highlight each abuse by the government, every one of these abuses, including the denial of visitation rights. We have to highlight them and at the same time each time we do that, reiterate the fact that we know that behind these abusive tactics is an effort to intimidate us and to make us think that we don't have the power, we, the people, meaning, and we have to assert very forcefully that the opposite is true, that we won't be intimidated, that no matter what they do, no matter how many visitors are prevented from visiting, no matter how many times people coming out of the embassy, including journalists, are stopped and treated as if they might be criminals or as if they might be under suspicion, no matter how many times these kind of power tactics are used, they won't be effective because we understand them, we reject them, we know that the cause that we're fighting for is a just and righteous cause, and that we do, in fact, have public opinion on our side. The real task, in my mind, the real task is to take the passive public opinion that is generally sympathetic to WikiLeaks and sympathetic to Julian Assange and make it less and less passive. And the way this happens is very dynamic in movement building, I think, because the reason people choose to act, when they decide in all of their busy lives with many, many other responsibilities between work and family and so on and so forth, when they decide to make time to make a difference, they do it because they feel that they can make a difference. In other words, the sense of hope or the sense of making a difference or the possibility of making the difference is psychologically the key to movement building. People go into the streets, they do all kinds of courageous things that they wouldn't do otherwise if they believe it'll make a difference. And that's why I think we have to, again, expose and highlight each abuse and then reiterate, we know what they're doing, we aren't afraid, we are not intimidated, we're going to keep doing what we are doing. And as we do it, we will be like that proverbial snowball that gains strength and additional support and additional mass as we do it. So anyway, without knowing specifics, that would be my general response.
Well, that's a very brilliant and incisive analysis, Brian, as your previous comments were. I just wanted to clarify that it was one of Assange's lawyers that was stopped and asked for an ID, not a journalist, but would not be surprised if it happens to a journalist coming out. The guy who should be stopped and frisked is Luke Harding. But in any case, I wonder if, Kathy, you want to come on to the conversation? Kathy Vogan from Australia. We want that Australian perspective. Are you there? Are you not there? Okay.
I'm here.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I've just been busting to say, and I keep typing it into the chat, that of the three people who were barred today, the one I'm most concerned about and shocked by is Fidel Naves, who was the head of the Ecuadorian embassy from July 2012 to 2018, and who has already made a public statement that the Manafort visits did not happen. So it's interesting that Vaughan Smith and the Australian ABC journalist and Naves were all due to arrive there on the same day. I don't know if there was a story. Maybe the phone wasn't going to be left at the reception, or the cameras weren't going to be left at the reception. I can't speculate on that at all. But what is particularly shocking is that the man who ran the embassy for 6 years has just been denied entry.
His own embassy.
Correct.
He's a citizen of Ecuador. Is he still working in the Ecuadorian government? Does he have another position? You know?
I don't know whether Fidel has another position. I haven't heard of one. But yeah, he retired, or he was retired, replaced in May 2018, I believe it was, May last year. And then we have the new ambassador, who's Marchand, who's a totally different kettle of fish.
Well, that is really an extraordinary thing, that his own government has barred him from entering his embassy. Even if he were just an average Ecuadorian citizen, that would be something that there would have to be a damn good reason, I would think. But he was the man who ran that embassy, was the consul general. and they
Yeah.
don't want him seeing Assange. So this is a big message they're sending here again. I love Brian's analysis there, that it's part of this intimidation and this creating this sense of inevitability that, you know, we opened up the doors for a little while because there were no visitors allowed. Now, I don't know how long that window will stay open, but this guy who ran our embassy and was on Assange's side and supported his asylum there, it can't come in. Nor can the founder of the Frontline Club.
Well, you have this happening. Naves being barred from going into the embassy, perhaps at the same time as two journalists, certainly same day. At the same time in Ecuador, today you have the Department of Justice is interviewing 6, no less, Ecuadorian diplomats about the Manafort visits. So we have the guy who said, no, it never happened, the head. And I thought, well, they have to interview Fidel Naves. But in fact, he's in London trying to see Assange. They won't let him in. So I have to see these two as related because it's all happening on the same day.
That's quite
and
interesting.
It's all around Manafort.
That is very interesting because there's no doubt he would have to be questioned. But when these investigators want a certain answer, they don't ask certain people who give them the answer they don't want. Just like they've never asked, the Mueller's people have never asked Assange or anyone associated with WikiLeaks about the so-called emails going to WikiLeaks and who gave them to him. They've never been questioned. If they really go into the bottom of this crime, they would have to question WikiLeaks, and they haven't. So if they really want to find out if Manafort really was there that day, they'd have to answer the former consul, and they will not ask him, and he's being barred from entering his own embassy in London at the same time. As I said earlier, I think it's going to be interesting. If we don't hear anything more about this questioning going on in Quito, then they probably didn't get the answers they wanted. They probably have been told, well, he was not there. And I also brought up at the beginning the fact that the third author of the Luke Harding story that Manafort visited Assange in the embassy, this guy Valencienzo, has been outed now as having been funded by the NED, the National Endowment of Democracy, with $65,000 to run a website, supposedly investigative journalism website, which was pumping out anti-Korea propaganda, essentially. And he got a byline in The Guardian, this guy, who is being paid for by the U.S. government. The NED being very well known, of course, around the world for stirring up unrest against governments the U.S. do not like and would like to see either undermined or overthrown. It has a long record of that. And as I mentioned, Washington Post wrote in the 1980s that the NED was doing what the CIA used to do covertly. They're now doing openly.
Joe?
Yes.
I like to go back to visitation rights. I think this is really important. I think Brian is exactly right, and Kathy as well, in making the case that we need to publicize this. I mean, we need to get this around so people care. I mean, it's really blatant. When I go back, people aren't as old as I am, but there was a Cardinal Mindszenty, right? Okay. Now he got free when the brief Hungarian Revolution took place in Budapest, okay? But then when the communists came back in, he had to flee to the U.S. Embassy, okay? Now, Cardinal Mindszenty, under these terrible Hungarian communists, had more privileges and more visitation rights. His mother used to come to see him regularly. And can Julian's mother come to see him regularly? I don't think so. So this is pretty heinous, you know? And so not only that, in other words, not only is it necessary to highlight and get this story out, but also this. The Bundestag members, that was big. That was 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, whatever it was. They made a statement and they went home. Now, what about parliamentarians from other countries? That was pretty gutsy of those Linke, the left party there in the Bundestag in Germany. Are there no other parliamentarians that care about Julian Assange? I've been writing to my friends in Dublin. Why not send some people from the Dáil there, the parliament there, to see Julian? In other words, even if they, it's not very expensive to go from Dublin to London, okay? Even if they get there and they can't get in, there's a story there. And I think there should be enough people, members of parliament and of the European Parliament, that should try to do that, because only that way can there be the publicity that Brian talks about as necessary to get people from being lethargic to being activists and caring about these things.
Yeah, I'd just like to make reference to the special protocol because it's stated therein and has been enforced in relation to Julian's lawyers that he can only receive visitors during visiting hours. Now, what I believe has happened today is that 3 visitors who applied earlier in the week have been denied entry during visiting hours. So reminds me of when I wanted to see my dog in quarantine, and suddenly they capriciously said, no, you can't see her. And I just walked straight through and I said, no, them's not the rules. So I'm not breaking them by walking in to see my dog. Not that you could do that at the Ecuadorian embassy, but they have actually broken their own rules, which have been defended, in terms of the barring of Assange's lawyers before he had to appear in court in Ecuador. I think Joe's just popped off. I was very interested in your impish discussion about FAT32 data, Ray and William, because it's, I'm not quite sure how it was worded, if words were chosen carefully, but that's interesting news. I mean, it further supports that there was no hacking.
Yep, that's right. It goes along with what Craig Murray was saying, and also basically what Julian was saying. So, I didn't find any inconsistency there, but it's basic evidence that people are ignoring.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, how is it that mainstream news won't pick up your information? Do you think there's actually a bar on it, if it's on that list?
Yeah, in fact, absolutely, because they don't want to, because they lose plausible deniability if I'm allowed to testify in court or in Congress. For example, and I would say I when I testified to the Bundestag, the German parliament, about this mass spying, the United States government sent representatives over to listen. I mean, they came 4,000 miles to hear me testify instead of coming 20 miles up the road. You know what I mean? So that's how they're so desperate not to get my whatever I have to say out to anybody, because then it would unmask them. It's like they're playing the Wizard of Oz game. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, and I'm just a little Toto going over there pulling the curtain back. And they can't have that. That's this effort to silence the truth, or whatever truth there is. They simply don't want it out if it contradicts in any way the narrative they want to spin.
Hey, Bill, tell the story about your last day at NSA as you were exiting the premises, what they asked you and how you replied.
Oh, they didn't ask me, Ray. I just told them when I was leaving. Of course, you had to turn in your badge, so I quickly did that. And on the way out the door, I said, "Elvis has left the building." And then when I got down at the bottom of the steps, I said, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty." I mean, I was not very quiet about it. I was being very loud, and everybody walking around could hear it. So,
but they asked you whether you had classified information with you, didn't they?
Oh no, they search you if you left. At least that's what they did in art. But this guy Martin, obviously, who took all all that data out from the spying group in NSA. I mean, he had large amounts of hard copy data and all kinds of things you'd have to tote and physically remove. Well, they're supposed to be searching these people. When I was there, we got searched, Yeah. And so, the thing is, the place is really disintegrated when they've outsourced everything. And so, hey, outsource,
Didn't you tell them that you had a lot of classified information right here?
Well, yeah. I mean, of course, I said, you can't take anything out. I said, well, I understood that, but I still have my brain. Thank you.
Oh, I'm glad they let you keep that.
In your
Hey,
memory.
Bill, there's a question here from a viewer addressed to you, Bill.
Yeah.
Martin O'Connor asks, how long would it take to transfer DNC data to a thumb drive? In that particular case.
To a thumb drive? Probably a minute, maybe.
All of the emails, the entire email database of the DNC could be transferred to a thumb drive in a minute?
It could go down at, 40, with the highest we got for the down rate for the Goose for Two stuff could be handled by a thumb drive, and that was 49.1 megabytes per second. That's that means that it could go 49.1 million characters.
Okay, so getting that thumbnail out of the DNC would not be as difficult as getting a piece of paper out of the NSA.
No,
as we just
no. I mean, that's basically how a lot of this is done. Just put it on a small thumb drive or something like that could be easily hidden.
Yeah, and our viewers should understand that is possible across the internet, is it?
Yeah.
So that's the bottom line of the forensic evidence, that it was copied, leaked.
Well, we tried. We of course tried to transfer it across the Atlantic to Europe in various places. In London and Amsterdam and in Belgrade and also in Albania and everything. We went further and further east we went, the harder. I mean, the less capability there was. So
Who do you mean by we, Bill? When you said we,
I recruited one of the senior hackers in Europe, and our people. I mean, I said, "You want to help us do this little test?" And he said, "Sure." So, and he travels around Europe giving talks. So, he did the testing from trying to pull it across. And I, one of the guys that in the VIPS group was joining us in the discussion. He said, "Hey, I could set up the database or the data set, and you can try to pull it across." So he set it up over here, and my hacker friend went around Europe trying to pull it across, and it didn't work.
And the amount of data that was
actually, I actually think I had the formula for the amount of data that the service providers will allow any one person to transfer across the net at any given time. That's so they don't, if for example, I put a gigabit per minute out there to try to transfer it, that would take up quite a bit of bandwidth. So they have a limit on what they'll allow so that no one can monopolize the band. And so I think I have that formula. It's like 8.8 megabytes per second for every 100 megabit that you own. So in other words, for a 100 megabit line, we got 0.8 megabytes going across per second. And for 200 megabit line, we got 1.6 megabytes going across. And for what I calculated to be a 1.5 gigabit line, we got 12 megabytes per second. And if you work it out, for every 100 megabits, it's 0.8 megabytes.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second, Bill, because Brian has to go. I just want to give him a chance.
Okay.
Give a final word, but I hope you can stick around, Bill, and we go back to this topic. Brian.
Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt Bill. It's always so fascinating to actually hear from people who know what they're talking about. It's so unusual. I do want to say I have to run because I'm going to another meeting on a different issue right now. But I do want to say this, that I think that all of us have to think now, and I know many of the people who are the really core organizers here have already been thinking and have been planning and working stuff out. But for us to, in the coming, maybe not days, but certainly within the next few weeks, to have some coordinated offline, real life sort of manifestations of support and solidarity, that even if they're not large in any one place, that we have them all over the place. I think that like I'm with the Answer Coalition. We have, chapters in about 40 cities. Some of them are big cities and some of them are big chapters. Many are small. It doesn't really matter. We know that if the people who really believe in what WikiLeaks is doing and are absolutely outraged by the mistreatment, the arbitrary detention that Julian Assange is facing, this sort of all-out assault. If we can give everybody who wants to do something a way to do something in a coordinated way, so that we can say, for instance, look, on such and such a day, people in 200 cities all around the world did something with a unified message, calling for the freedom for Julian Assange, to stop the war against Julian Assange and whistleblowers. I just really believe the time is now, because I think we will succeed with it. And certainly from the point of view of the Answer Coalition, we would do our part to spread the word, to notify our organizers and activists and volunteers from around the country. And I think people would be more than happy to do it. So just something to think about as we keep planning. I think the online vigils are amazing, because it gives such an opportunity for people to really hear such a wide, diverse grouping of voices of people who, like Bill Binney, actually know what they're talking about. I think it's like extremely meaningful. And if we can sort of amplify it with a offline sort of street presence sometime soon, I think it would be great. And certainly, again, we would do our part to help out.
Well, that's great, Brian. Absolutely wonderful words. And thank you for joining us tonight and giving us some time.
Okay.
I hope you come back again sometime soon. Okay.
Will do. Thanks.
Okay, bye. So Kathy Wogan has one event in Sydney coming up. Why don't you talk about that, Kathy?
Okay, here I go. I'll just share the screen. I will share the sound just in case.
Oh, we're going to have
All right. All right, folks, here we go. Speaking of events all over the world, we're going to do our second big night live to air in Sydney. This one's a sort of a wider topic. The last one was called The Gagging of Julian Assange. And we had Christine Assange, Julian's mother, and Susie Dawson. This time we have Joe Lauria from Consortium News.
Who?
We have
Who? Oh.
Joe Lauria himself. Yeah, I'm not going to say any more about that. We have Caitlin Johnson, who's one of our favorite independent journalists, rogue journalists, and bogan socialist, she calls herself. We have Tony Kevin, who's the former Australian ambassador, who came out recently in support of Julian Assange and has been very vocal in criticising our government about trading arms with Saudi Arabia. And we have James Cogan, who was supposed to come last time but couldn't make it, who spoke alongside John Pilger in Sydney. He's from the Socialist Equality Party, and they organised Pilger's talk in Sydney. Now, for this one, I said it was a bit of a wider topic because that second line there, the future of democracy, is what I want people to think about. I want people to kind of, briefing on the talking notes a little bit, but to get people to think about the long term. Where are we moving? Where are we moving in the after all this digital disruption? Where are we moving through the 21st century with democracy? Is it going to be direct, as the French Gilets jaunes are calling for, with an alleged 70% support from the French population? Will France be the beacon that leads us to direct democracy? And if we get direct democracy, would that ever come with the right to make informed decisions? And in that case, there would have to be a place for WikiLeaks in that future. So it's a roundabout way, but a wider discussion and an invitation to look at the wider perspective and the place of WikiLeaks in the world, and the importance of First Amendment, of course, but as a vehicle for the safe delivery of truth. Okay, so that's it. That's my plug.
Well, thank you, Kathy. And thank you for using the actual logo from Consortium News on there. That's great. We're joined by Cassandra Fairbanks from Washington. Hello, Cassandra. Are you unmuted?
Hey, how are you?
You're unmuted.
Sorry, I'm on my phone again. So
that's okay. You didn't have to tell us. It's very clear. But we were talking before about these two incidents today outside the embassy. Do you know about them? That one of Assange's lawyers, when he was exiting, was stopped by British police and undercover apparently, and demanded ID to show his ID. And there were two surveillance cars there, or two unmarked cars parked there with this undercover British police officer. And then at some time, I think after that, three journalists coming out, had applied for permission to see Assange. Not only three journalists, and that was Vaughn Smith, who's the founder of the Frontline Club, which maybe you visited when you were in London. It's a media club, pretty much like the press club here in Washington. And then as ABC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation journalist, who was a hostage of the Taliban, Sean Langan, were denied permission to see Assange. But more interestingly, as Kathy has pointed out, is that Ecuador's former consul to the UK, Fidel Narvaez, who was indeed the guy who ran the embassy for the early years of Assange being there, he was denied entry into his own embassy today by the Ecuadorian government. He's still an Ecuadorian citizen. He may even still be working in the government somewhere, and they wouldn't let him in his own embassy. I just want to know your reaction to that. If you've just been there to see Julian a couple of weeks ago.
I knew that they had been denied. I didn't hear about his lawyer being stopped. That's insane.